Yes, period. It just turned 3:15, comma, so I started it, period. Hello, you can hear me again?
Yes, and we are ready to proceed. Thank you very much.
You are, okay. Just going to turn up the sound a little bit. Sometimes it takes a few minutes for people to come out of the breakout rooms. It's counting down. He'll be back in 10 seconds. 8, 7. Hey, Mr. Jacobs, can you hear me again?
I can, ma'am.
All right. All right, and everyone is ready, correct?
Yes.
All right, I'll let everyone know. Thank you. It's fuller than I thought.
You're looking forward to having everything in person. All rise. Court is now in session.
Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. Good afternoon. We are back on the record, and we are next calling the case of the people of the state of Michigan versus Gary Jacobs. It's file 205839-FH. The record should reflect that Mr. Jacobs is appearing from the Michigan Department of Corrections via Zoom. His attorney, Ms. Henderson, is also appearing via Zoom, as is the Attorney General's office through Ms. Bennett. Counsel, we were scheduled for a sentencing hearing at this time. I would remind everyone that this matter is being broadcast via YouTube Live. Ms. Bennett, were you ready to proceed?
I am, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Henderson, were you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
And Mr. Jacobs, you can hear us okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Bennett, you are moving for the sentencing of Mr. Jacobs?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. And before we get there, Ms. Bennett, you had also filed the second amended information. Did you wish to make a further record of that?
I did, and I appreciate the court letting me do that. What happened was the information was amended after the preliminary examination, but it was never typed up that way and filed. It originally was charged as CSE second person under 13, and it was amended to person 13 to 15 relationship. So I did file a second amended information that should have the correct PAC code on that. That should be MCL 750.520C1B. And that should just be amended on the plea form. It should be CSE second degree person 13 to 15 relationship with that PAC code. The only other thing it should change on that plea form, Your Honor, is instead of tier 3, it should be tier 2 sex offender registry.
All right. And you don't believe that amendment affects the underlying integrity of the plea itself, correct?
I don't, Your Honor.
All right. Ms. Henderson, any objection to the second amended information that's been filed, first of all?
No, Your Honor.
All right. And I'll ask the same question to you, Ms. Henderson. Do you believe that affects the integrity of the plea, given that the amendment has just changed the PAC code?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. All right. Ms. Henderson, Ms. Bennett has moved for the sentencing of Mr. Jacobs. Before we proceed with that sentencing, I think we've discussed this previously in another hearing, but your client is agreeing to waive the right to be sentenced in person. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And you've had that discussion with him?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Jacobs, just for the record, you understand you have the absolute right to be sentenced in person, sir?
Yes, Your Honor.
And under the circumstances, you're willing to waive that requirement and appear via Zoom for the sentencing hearing. Is that correct?
Yes, correct, Your Honor.
Has anybody promised you anything in order to get you to waive that right to be sentenced in person, sir?
No, Your Honor.
Has anybody threatened you or coerced you in any way to get you to waive that right?
No, Your Honor.
And are you doing so freely, voluntarily, understandingly, and knowingly, sir?
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. The court is finding that the right to be sentenced in person is being freely, voluntarily, and understandingly and knowingly made here. I am going to accept that waiver and will agree to continue the sentencing hearing via Zoom. Ms. Henderson, with respect to the pre-sentence investigation report, I assume you've had an opportunity to review that and review it with your client. Is that correct?
That is correct, Your Honor.
And other than the jail credit, were you aware of any factual inaccuracies or other challenges to the pre-sentence investigation report, including any sentencing guideline challenges that you wish to make?
No, Your Honor, only the jail correction.
All right. And counsel, I believe 504 days of jail credit would be the correct amount given the adjournment of the last sentencing hearing.
That sounds correct, Your Honor, yes.
All right. Ms. Bennett?
I have reviewed the report and the guidelines. I have no additions, deletions, or corrections, and I believe that is a correct calculation of the additional time since the adjourned hearing.
All right, thank you. And counsel, I'll advise both of you that there were a large number of letters submitted to the court, many on behalf of Mr. Jacobs, and I've also received a significant amount of letters and information from the victims of the various offenses. I have had an opportunity to review all of those matters in chambers. I've reviewed them again today prior to this sentencing hearing. Ms. Henderson, that being said, is there anything else you wish to advise the court of before the court imposes sentence upon your client, ma'am?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. On the topic of Gary Jacobs as a person, I think that the character letters that the court has just referenced really speaks volumes more than I could say on the record about what kind of a person he is to his friends and his family. I can, however, personally say that over the last 16 months, I have spent many, many hours with Mr. Jacobs, both in person and on the phone. And I found that based on my conversations with him, that he is the person that his family and friends describe him to be. I found him to be kind and compassionate and generous, personable, thoughtful, all of the things that his supporters describe him as being. He has conveyed to me how sorry he is about this offense and the harm that has been caused by the offenses, and has expressed what I perceive as a genuine relief that nobody will be put to the pain of a trial, that this case will come to closure without a contested trial to be determined by, with his guilt to be determined by a jury, and rather through a guilty plea. You know, it's no secret that there are institutions in our society that have struggled with a scourge of sexual abuse scandals. I mean, the Catholic Church is one of them, but by no means the only one. And Mr. Jacobs was part of that environment, himself abused as a young person while being brought up in the Catholic Church, and then admitted into the process of the seminary at the time that he was a developing adolescent himself. He was, as part of his admission to the seminary and becoming a priest, cloistered from the ordinary development that adolescents have. And he entered the priesthood basically as a sexually stunted and repressed individual who was also an abuse victim. To that mix, the addition of alcohol came, alcohol abuse in the extreme, and that created the perfect climate to perpetuate the cycle of abuse and create the next generational cycle. That is the environment that Gary Jacobs was brought into and that he was part of. Now, all that said, you know, there's a tendency in the public discourse to paint individuals in the position like Gary Jacobs is in as monsters, or irredeemable people who should be sequestered for the rest of their lives in a prison setting. But Gary Jacobs is not a monster, and he is not irredeemable. How do I know this? Because in 1988, he sought out the help of his bishop to address his alcohol abuse, his florid and uncontrolled alcohol abuse, and acknowledged that he was totally out of control at that time. He sought and received years of intensive therapy, first to address his alcohol abuse, and then later was able to come to terms with his sexual identity as a gay man. That was not something that he could have done at the time that he was a part of the Catholic Church structure at that time. He, with the support of the treatment he received, became a recovering alcoholic, an openly gay man who was in a committed and monogamous relationship, now a marriage. And he has redeemed himself in a way that has allowed him to bear good fruit for 35 years. He will continue to bear good fruit, even into the years of his punishment, which he is now serving, having appeared here from the Michigan Department of Corrections. Even if he's eventually released from prison in this lifetime, I'm sure that he will be bearing good fruit for the rest of his days, because the history of the last 35 years of his conduct shows that he is capable and able to do it, even basically with the assistance of his treatment and with his God. Now, these facts might not do anything to help the victims recover from the harm that they undeniably suffered, but we have to say these facts because they paint the true picture and the complete picture of the Gary Jacobs case. Ultimately, there's really no question that some significant punishment is appropriate here. A significant loss of freedom is necessary and proper in a case like this. But from the defense's perspective, the negotiated plea agreement strikes the right balance between punishment and recognition of the history and characteristics of the defendant, including his redemption. We respectfully, for those reasons, request that the court follow the plea agreement and impose sentence accordingly.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Henderson. I appreciate those comments. Ms. Bennett, is there anything that you wish to advise the court of at this time on behalf of the people?
I would, and thank you for your time, Judge. And I don't think it's going to be any secret that both counsel and I have a different perspective on the man that Gary Jacobs is. And there's no doubt he sought out treatment for his alcoholism. But, I'm going to start out by saying exactly what I said in Ontonagon County, Judge. A quote by Leonardo da Vinci, that nothing strengthens authority so much as silence. And that is the key here. It's that silence that really implored Mr. Jacobs to continue to be this man of authority for so long, and that these victims kept silent for so long. And I'm a little sad that the victims weren't here today. I will say that Ontonagon County sentencing took a lot out of them, but they wanted their statements to be heard by you, and I did send those. But I could never do their words justice. I could sit here and read every one of those letters today, and I would not do their words justice. The pure pain and trauma that they conveyed at the last sentencing, I could not do that justice. I want to note that one of the victims in the Ontonagon matter at exam said something that really stuck with me for the last year. He was asked about Gary Jacobs, the man, and who he was to him as a teenager. And he said Gary Jacobs was, quote, one step away from God in my mind. And that really never left me hearing him say that. It really kind of forced me, Your Honor, to take a step back and try to figure out what life looked like for these victim survivors back in the 70s and the 80s. A very small community. On one side of the picture, you have a trusted pastor, priest, religious leader, a revered, charismatic man. All the victims said he was charismatic, beloved. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have these young boys, 13, 14, and 15. Some of them were even younger than that. And they were vulnerable and they were impressionable. And Mr. Jacobs may not have been able to come out and live his life as a gay man back then, but it should never have been at the expense of these young people that he lived that life. And that's exactly what happened. They were victimized, and Gary Jacobs has been able to move forward and move on. And so many of them have not. And so it's not just the victims, Judge. Many of their parents really opened their lives and their homes to Mr. Jacobs. He shared meals in their homes. He slept under their roof among their beloved children. And they just wholeheartedly, to their core, trusted this man who abused these children, sometimes in their own homes while the parents slept. We are here for a guilty plea. Mr. Jacobs did take responsibility and pled guilty as charged in this offense, as he did in the other cases. And I am going to also ask that you follow the sentence agreement. The reason I state that now is I'm going to say a few statements, and Ms. Henderson is well aware. I've sent her some of the messages that Mr. Jacobs has sent out to his supporters. And I'm just going to cite to them briefly, not because I'm asking for anything to be changed. I think this victim agreement, or the sentence agreement rather, is in the victim's best interest. It does save them a long, elaborate trial. But I just want the court to be aware that when I heard Mr. Jacobs express remorse and grief over what he did to these victims, it's not unusual. The court knows this. It's not unusual for a defendant to spin the narrative a bit to his supporters in calls and letters, save face, continue to have that support. It's not unusual, especially in these cases. However, what I found deeply disappointing is Mr. Jacobs sending out messages the very day of his Ontonagon sentence, the very day he left and went back to the jail, saying that the victims were, quote, lying and grossly exaggerating. Even going so far as to say that the prosecutor orchestrated these really painful and devastating statements that they gave to Judge Pope in Ontonagon County, that we orchestrated that, which could not be further from the truth. And I say this because Mr. Jacobs has always maintained that other than a couple of the victims, he drank a lot back in the day. He was an alcoholic, and he has very little memory, if any memory, of some of these assaults. And I guess I'll just say you can't have it both ways. You cannot call these victims liars and grossly exaggerating. You cannot challenge the truth of their pain when you claim you don't even remember some of the pain you put them through. That being said, there's no adulation for these men. There's no benefit for them coming forward. There's no applause. There's no parade for them. There's no benefit they gained by coming forward and telling their story. And it's a painful story. Perhaps one of the reasons Mr. Jacobs thought that these statements were orchestrated is because there were so many painful common themes throughout those letters that I know the court read. Many of them, multiple failed relationships, substance abuse, alcoholism themselves. One victim was victimized in his own shower, in his own bathroom. He cannot use the public restrooms as a grown adult man. One victim stated that he can't leave the house. He missed one of his children's wedding. These are men who were boys who were deeply traumatized. And I know that the court believes their words, and that is important to me. But it's important to me that Gary Jacobs supporters know that as well. I read each and every one of the letters that were submitted on his behalf, and I appreciated every one of them. Actually, one of his supporters came up to me after the last hearing and was very kind to us and very kind about our victims. But there was two common themes to me in those letters as well. The alcoholism as the culprit, the finger pointed at the alcoholism. And the second theme was, this is not the Gary Jacobs we know. We know a very different Gary Jacobs. And to that I say, I believe that. Of course I believe that. You were not victimized by Gary Jacobs. It is not uncommon in these cases for a perpetrator to have multiple faces, right? The face they show the world and the face that their victims see. And it's a very different person. So unfortunately for these victims, that was a different person than the person Ms. Henderson talks about, the person that's in the letters, in the supportive letters. That is a different person to these men who were then boys. He is a monster to them. Almost about living in a prison themselves, life in prison for them. And so I hope they know today that they are believed and they are survivors, and we hope that they feel a sense of justice, because we are here 30, 40 years later, depending on which case we're talking about. And for the victims, it's still very raw and real. Mr. Jacobs, I'll say he had the benefit of picking up, leaving going on to have a spouse, a lovely home, a job, friends and family, and being able to, if we are to believe him, being able to forget, right? Being able to not have a memory of all this horrific trauma that he inflicted. I think it's very lucky if that's the case, that he doesn't remember that. And I feel like the victims here did not have that luxury of picking up, moving on, and forgetting. They remember it every single day. I will say that I think justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied. So I hope that the sentencing today and the sentencing that took place in Ontonagon County, I hope that's a reminder of that. And I hope that each and every one of them know that they're believed by me, they're believed by the court. Even if others don't believe them, they are believed in, and they can have justice today. I'd ask you to follow the sentence agreement of the 8 to 15 years on the CSC second degree, along with the other aspects of the sentence agreement, which was sex offender counseling and sex offender registration. And I thank you for your time today.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Bennett. Mr. Jacobs, you also have an opportunity to address the court at this time if you wish to, sir.
No, Your Honor, I did that when I was in Ontonagon, but thank you for offering.
All right. You're welcome. All right. Thank you, counsel. As counsel is certainly well aware, there are generally 4 primary objectives of sentencing. Those include punishment, rehabilitation, deterrence, and protection of society. I am taking all 4 of those factors into consideration when imposing this sentence. And while the first 3 factors that I mentioned are of primary concern, all 4 of the factors are relevant to the court's decision, and I believe that the sentence that is going to be imposed will effectively work towards achieving each of those goals. It is also important to understand that I am only imposing a sentence for the crime that occurred in Dickinson County. I will reference the companion offenses in my remarks, but I cannot impose a sentence for crimes for which there were no convictions or for crimes that were committed in other jurisdictions. Mr. Jacobs, I have carefully listened to your attorney and the prosecutor. I have closely read the pre-sentence investigation report. As I indicated at the beginning of this hearing, I have read the letters from your many supporters. I have read carefully the victim's impact statements and the other information that has been presented to the court. To say that this case is disturbing would be a gross understatement, sir. Mr. Jacobs, you were placed in a position of trust and faith. There are certain positions in our society that are held inherently to a higher standard. Being a Catholic priest is one of those positions. And I'm sure, as Ms. Henderson has referenced, that you have accomplished many good things in your life, and perhaps even as part of that occupation or calling. But the manner in which you conducted yourself during that time is both disgusting and inexcusable. I believe that you deserve to be punished harshly and to the fullest extent of the law for your deeds. I have had the privilege of knowing many good priests that are kind, generous, and compassionate souls. We are also blessed to have many good priests working in our community. As a priest, you have the respect and admiration of your parishioners. You are always supposed to do the right thing, even when no one is looking. Our society places their trust in those individuals that are doing God's work and expects them to help guide us and live better and more meaningful lives, not abuse their authority. And while forgiveness, compassion, and mercy are certainly instrumental to the Catholic faith, it is entirely appropriate to remind you, sir, that your breach of trust extended well beyond the victims of your many crimes. It has rippled through our entire community. You have also breached the faith of the Catholic Church and the Catholic community. You, through your horrific actions, have even caused some people to question the Church and its leadership. And for those who were in leadership positions at the Church, who allegedly chose to look the other way, shame on them. They too are responsible for the havoc and personal destruction that was caused by you, Mr. Jacobs. Instead of using your position, which again inherently commands respect, to help and assist our communities, you used your authority and status to prey upon children. You very clearly utilized your position of trust to take advantage of these victims, and that is inexcusable. You have placed your own selfish, prurient desires above all else, and it is frankly disgusting, Mr. Jacobs. You have completely and utterly breached the trust and faith that was placed in you. You have groomed and preyed upon innocent victims in our community and used your status to help accomplish your evil deeds. In my view, for what you have done, the court cannot punish you sufficiently or enough to satisfy the demands of justice. In other words, Mr. Jacobs, I wish there was more that I could do to punish you for your abhorrent criminal acts. I'm not sure where it went wrong for you or when you made the decision to go down this very dark and dangerous road, but I do know that your conduct is shameful and reprehensible. It is unfortunate that you were able to live out much of your life without true accountability and punishment for your crimes. I have also read your statement and letters from your supporters that try to link your alcohol problem to your crimes. Your addictions do not justify or excuse your conduct in any way, Mr. Jacobs. There are many alcoholics that are not pedophiles. That is simply your convenient way of trying to deflect responsibility and accountability. And I don't buy that for a minute. You are a truly sick individual who made the conscious choice to rape and molest young boys in our communities. You did it repeatedly to numerous victims throughout the Upper Peninsula. To try and diminish your responsibility to an alcohol problem is a pathetic attempt to try and manipulate the truth of this matter. You sexually molested and raped countless young teenage boys for your own sexual gratification. And when you're sitting in prison, I hope you reflect back upon all the lives and generations of individuals that you have destroyed. Your numerous supporters have written to tell me that you are a changed man who deserves leniency and compassion. What compassion did you have, Mr. Jacobs, for all of those children that you assaulted and raped? Another of your supporters stated that you have been vilified in the media, and a senior Catholic priest from the Diocese of Marquette had the audacity to write that the tragedy in all of this is that you're a very different person now. With all due respect to that priest, the real tragedy in this, Mr. Jacobs, is all of the victims' lives that have been ruined and their families that have suffered. It is the generational and constant anguish and pain that you have so selfishly inflicted. Perhaps your supporters need to read the letters from the victims and their impact statements and the captions or portions of the police reports where you acknowledge anal and oral sex with these young boys. Perhaps they should know about the gory details about how you preyed upon and raped these young boys who were too young and terrified to fight back. Maybe then your supporters will truly understand and pray for God to have mercy on your soul, because it is crystal clear to this court that you are a monster. Regardless of your religious affiliation and regardless of the wonderful person that you merely pretended to be. It has also been suggested that you have been living in a prison of guilt for the last 40 years and that you have been punishing yourself to a degree. Well, it seems to me that you were able to go about living and enjoying your new life out west. You had a new career, you met a new life partner, you established a home, and you were able to go on living. The same cannot be said for all of the young boys that you sexually assaulted. You deprived them of that chance at happiness, and you went about living your own life. It may be true that you've helped others along the way, as your counsel points out, and that you were a good neighbor and friend later in life. But honestly, Mr. Jacobs, you were just living a lie. Your conscience may have bothered you at times, but it was certainly not enough for you to apologize to any of your victims or to turn yourself into the authorities. So I am not compelled by those arguments. I do want to read aloud some of the things that the victims have written about you and your criminal acts, Mr. Jacobs, and I realize that they may have been acknowledged in other courts, but I believe that this record too should be complete. And my hope is that in listening to some of these words again, you will have a better appreciation of the damage that you have so selfishly inflicted. I also agree with Ms. Bennett that I can't do this justice. I can't read each and every one of these completely into the record. They have been submitted to the court, but I think portions of them are relevant and should be read into the record. So these are different portions of the victim's impact statements that are being read now. Your Honor, it's difficult to adequately convey the extent of the damage Gary Jacobs did to me, to my life, to my health, both physical and mental, to the relationships with those around me, with my family and friends, or the damage that is still being done and will continue to be done until the day I die. This monster, this horrible excuse for a human being sitting before you today began fondling me inappropriately when I was a small child. Gary locked me and every one of his victims, of which I understand there are many, in our own prisons, of which there is no release. With this sentence of 8 to 15 years, he might actually survive his prison term. I and the rest of the victims will not survive the prison sentences he issued for us because those were for life. What Gary did to me destroyed me and set me on a significantly altered path in life, one that has seen so much pain, so much suffering, so many tears I couldn't even begin to count. There is no erasing what happened, no ability to press the reset button and go back and experience the life I would have had with my parents had Gary never assaulted me. The lifelong prison sentence he issued to not only me, but also my parents who now get to live out their days knowing they failed to protect me. There is no escape for any of us. His actions caused me to lose faith in my parents and also the church. The only way I was able to reconcile how a, quote, man of God, unquote, could be a pedophile was to decide that there is no God. Because of what Gary Jacobs did to me, I am an atheist. Because of what Gary did, I know there is no God, no salvation, no eternal life. It is all a terrible lie. I've gone to counseling on and off over the years to address the behavioral health issues and damage his actions caused. But after a while, I just gave up because I realized it didn't matter how many therapy appointments I attended, there was never going to be an end, no escape. This is a lifelong prison sentence. I'll never truly know what potential was robbed, what I might have been able to become, what sort of man I would have developed into, what sort of husband I could have been in the first 2 tries. If Gary Jacobs hadn't entered my life and decided to single-handedly destroy it to satisfy his own sick, disgusting, despicable sexual desires with a mere child. He deserves far more than 15 years in prison for what he's done. I've already endured more than 40. At this point, I'll take whatever I can get and hope that it's enough to someday move on. Till then, here I sit in my prison cell. At a young age, I was taught that a priest is a man who you would go to for spiritual guidance. A priest is a man of authority, and you never question a priest's authority because he was a man of God. I come here today to tell you about my journey, a journey that is full of pain, fear, and stress. It started back when I was 12 or 13 years old. That victim goes on to describe a lifetime of problems that he's experienced. He goes on to say, I was shocked to see documents that the church had about Gary Jacobs. They knew of his crimes and hid those crimes for 30 years. My memories may fade, but they will always come back to haunt me. At a young age, I was given a life sentence by Gary Jacobs, a life sentence full of scars and painful memories that will never go away, that I will never forget, and those memories will be with me until the day I die. Your Honor, first and foremost, I would like to thank all of Gary Jacobs' other victims for coming forward. I know how hard it was to do. I would never have come forward if it was not for them. I was victimized by Gary Jacobs in about 1975 when I was 12 or 13. I am now 57. Because of what he did to me, I have led a very sheltered life, and I know it is a direct result of what he did to me. Because of the trauma I suffered as a result of his actions and in an effort to cope, I struggled with drugs and alcohol for many years. I can never get all of those years of my life back. I wish I would have had the courage to come forward years ago. My life would have been much different and better. However, now that I know he is going to finally pay for what he has done, I can now finally move forward with my life. Once again, I can never thank enough the other victims for coming forward, and you will all be in my heart and prayers forever. It is important that Gary Jacobs understands what a particularly terrible crime sexual abuse is for the victim and that the after effects can last a lifetime. Gary Jacobs deserves to serve his maximum sentence. I realized that Gary Jacobs had worn a mask of a compassionate priest when I was 15. He was hunting for vulnerable boys to satisfy his sick appetite. His impeccable performance as a kind and understanding friend, wrapped in the glory and the spirituality of God and the church, easily won me over. He must pay for his crimes by serving his maximum sentence. Change was not easy. I was alone and fighting my past demons. I sought help through counseling. I learned to develop awareness and understanding of my black moods and my inability to feel anything. I learned techniques to help regulate my emotions. I discussed my struggle with my sexual identity and feeling conflicted because I felt attracted to men and women. My counselor told me that conflicted feelings are normal when you suffer childhood sexual abuse, and that counseling will teach me life skills that will help me deal with my feelings. I never imagined that the impacts of the sexual abuse I suffered at the hands of Gary Jacobs would continue to interfere and limit my professional and personal life years after the assault and on a daily basis. Gary Jacobs deserves to serve the maximum sentence. I am now 65 and my health prevents me from leading a fulfilling life. I still receive counseling. Dealing with depression, anxiety, and physical pain has left me feeling empty inside and devoid of any feeling. Whenever I feel any emotion welling up in me, it feels blocked. Instead of having an appropriate emotional response to what I feel, I cry. I have severe memory problems. There are parts of my past that are a complete blank. I am forgetful and easily confused. I feel that I have lost everything that is precious to me. Gary Jacobs deserves to experience how it feels to have lost everything precious to him. The impacts of sexual assault continue to affect me years after the assault on a daily basis. Not a day goes by when what Gary Jacobs has done to me does not interfere with my life or limit the life that I lead in some way. Sexual assault has cost me profoundly in many ways and has set my life on a completely different course from the one it would have taken had I not been assaulted. I have lost so much, and many of those losses cut right to the core of who I am and can never be undone. I believe child sexual abuse is worse than murder. Once you are dead, you are finished. When you are abused, you endure the mental anguish for the rest of your life. The sexual abuse that Gary Jacobs inflicted on me has interfered with and destroyed my life. The ripple effects of this man's crime against me as a boy are still present, and he must be held accountable by serving his maximum sentence. It is my belief now that Mr. Jacobs was never a man of God, but a child molester looking for the perfect camouflage, hoping if he got caught that the church would bail him out or cover it up. The sad part was Jacobs was right. The church knew and swept the issue under the rug, covered it up for years. Jacobs thought he won and got away with it, and I'm glad that he is getting a small part of what he deserves. But please remember, after years of Jacobs living free from justice, his victims have been sentenced to a life of shame and mental issues. Some of us had depressed some of the memories to now just have them reopened with the court cases, to suffer mentally all over again. No matter how many years Jacobs gets sentenced to in prison, the molested children that he violated, we will have a longer prison sentence in our minds. That's a lifetime sentence that we did not deserve. My thoughts and prayers also go out to the countless other individuals who are not present today that were abused by Mr. Jacobs. Hopefully they also find peace today. At the end of this day, Mr. Jacobs will be going off to prison where he belongs, but this will not be his final judgment. That judgment will come at the end of his days here on earth, and then he will have to account for his actions here to our Creator. May God have mercy on his soul. Again, that's a small, relatively small portion of the victim impact statements that were received by the court, and I believe it is important to incorporate some of those sentiments into this record. Mr. Jacobs, you deserve to go to prison for a very long time. You have personally inflicted misery and pain that will last a lifetime on these victims, and you should be punished accordingly. Sadly, the abuse that is inflicted by sex offenders is often felt by the next generation as well. The effects, as you probably realize by now, can be absolutely devastating, and that is evidenced by the victim's impact statements. It is the court's opinion that you should be locked away in a cell for a long time with other sexual offenders and deviants to serve your time. You absolutely deserve to lose your freedom for a significant period of time, and the maximum possible sentence is entirely appropriate. However, I do have an obligation to consider other factors, and I am bound by oath to follow the law. The plea agreement calls for a very specific sentence to be issued by this court. I am sure that the Attorney General's office has weighed this decision heavily and compassionately consulted with the victims and their families. They likely weighed the pros and cons of going to trial and the additional trauma that would be inflicted upon the victims if they had to go to court and testify about what you did to them. To the victims of these offenses, if you're listening, I want you to know that our thoughts and prayers are with you. My heart goes out to you and your families, and I wish there was something more that we could do to help restore you and your faith. I have read each and every one of your letters, and I am devastated and heartbroken by how this sick individual has affected you. It is clear to me that he has destroyed lives and imposed a sentence upon each and every one of you that will indeed last a lifetime. I wish that, again, there was more I could do within the confines of the law to help deliver you justice in this case. Again, given the severity of the defendant's misdeeds, there is nothing that the criminal justice system can do to make you each whole again. We can only hold this sexual deviant accountable within the limits of the law, and that is what I intend to do. I do want the victims to further understand that they are not at fault for this situation, and I sincerely hope that none of you blame yourselves for what happened so long ago. The fault lies entirely with the criminal defendant in this case. But I want you to know that this incident, while painful and embarrassing, does not have to define who each of you are. There are many survivors of abuse who have eventually gone on to lead happy and successful lives. And with the love and support of your friends and family, it is my sincere hope that you all eventually find peace and happiness. We don't always know why these things happen, and you could search your entire life and never find an answer. But what I'm telling you is that you cannot blame yourselves for this. Again, it is not your fault. You were unfortunate victims of a sexual predator, and you all showed incredible courage by eventually coming forward and sharing your traumatic experiences to hold the offender accountable. That could not have been easy for any of you, but it tells me that you are strong and resilient individuals. I hope that you are all finally able to close this chapter of your lives and are able to focus on a positive and successful recovery from this trauma. It will not necessarily be easy, and you may still find it helpful to work some of these feelings out in counseling or with other professionals, but my guess is that many of you are going to emerge from this stronger than ever, and I wish all of the victims the very best and nothing but success going forward. That being said, I also want to briefly discuss the other limitations that this court is facing. Due to the ages of the offenses, the court is bound to some degree by the 1988 version of the sentencing guidelines in this case, which are just 24 to 60 months. The plea agreement also calls for a set prison term of a minimum of 8 years and a maximum of 15 years. If I were to violate that sentencing agreement and exceed the sentencing guidelines and impose the maximum term allowed by the law, which would be 10 to 15 years instead of 8 to 15 years, I would be required to afford Mr. Jacobs the right to withdraw his guilty plea. And I have honestly struggled with this because I truly believe that Mr. Jacobs deserves the full 10 to 15 year prison sentence in the case. But my guess is that the AG's office and some of the victims were also similarly conflicted about the agreement. And given the defendant's age and his alleged health issues, I am going to reluctantly adhere to the plea agreement that was reached by the parties. I am not going to force the victims into a jury trial that may include further embarrassing or humiliating testimony. The court believes that enough damage has already been done. The sexual predator will be required to sit in prison until he is well into his 80s. He will also be required to register as a sex offender for the remainder of his time on earth. And at that late stage of his life, I am hopeful that he will not pose a threat to the public at large. For the record, and to use the prior guideline parlance, I am also satisfied that there are substantial and compelling reasons to deviate from the sentencing guideline range and to impose an upward departure. I am similarly satisfied under the Lockridge standard that this sentence is proportionate given all the facts and circumstances. The relevant factors in support of the decision are first and foremost the plea agreement that has been reached between the parties, the fact that the defendant has evaded justice for over 4 decades, the significant and overwhelming abuse of his position as a Catholic priest, the repeated sexual abuse over an extended period of time involving numerous victims, and the significant impact of the crimes on the victims and their extended families, as evidenced by the victims' impact statements. These are all factors that are inadequately accounted for in the sentencing guidelines and support an upward departure in accordance with the law. Therefore, it will be the order of the court that Mr. Jacobs will be remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections for a period of 8 to 15 years with credit for 504 days that have already been served. The sentence will be concurrent with the Ontonagon cases. He will get credit for these sentences at the same time he is serving those sentences as well. I'm also ordering that Mr. Jacobs must register as required by the Michigan Sex Offender Registration Act and comply with all of the requirements of that act. He must provide a completed copy of the Michigan Sex Offenders Registration Form to his field agent on his first in-person report date following the vacating of his residence, any address change, address verification, or change in status with an institution of higher education. At each address change or verification period, he must present his Michigan operator's license, chauffeur's license, or other personal identification card to the field agent, again, at his first in-person contact. I'm further ordering that he engage in sex offender counseling consistent with the agreement that was reached between the parties. I'm ordering that he pay a $68 state cost and a crime victims assessment in the amount of $130. I'm further indicating to Mr. Jacobs that he does have the right to appeal the decision and order of the court if he wishes to file an appeal. That has to be done within 42 days of today's date. If Mr. Jacobs couldn't afford his own attorney for that process, if he wishes to appeal, one would be appointed for him at public expense. We will send the appellate forms to Mr. Jacobs at his correctional facility for his review, and I'll ask that he initial one of those forms and have that sent back to the court for filing. I've also signed the sentence information report, the SIR 88-1, that will be forwarded to the clerk's office and the Department of Corrections as well. Council, I believe that concludes all of the court's findings and remarks at this time. Ms. Henderson, was there anything else that would need to be addressed on the record from the defense perspective?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Bennett, anything on behalf of the Attorney General's office?
I just simply want to thank the court for giving a voice to the victim's words. I could not have done as well, and for outlining the conflict of trial versus a plea. I think you did a remarkable job, and I know the victims will be very thankful. If they're not watching now, we're going to send them the link so that they can watch. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Bennett. And counsel, I appreciate you both and your efforts in these cases. I know it was challenging and difficult on both sides. So again, I appreciate your efforts and your work on behalf of the state of Michigan and on behalf of Mr. Jacobs, Ms. Henderson. Mr. Jacobs, is there anything that you wish to indicate to the court at this time, sir? Any questions that you have?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Good luck to you, sir. That will conclude this hearing. The court will stand in recess. Thank you, everyone.